Okay. Well, welcome everybody to round two of our series on, oops, it's black, but it will come back. There we go. On grant writing. And today, why is my thing not working? That's never a good sign. There we go. Not sure what I did differently. But this is the second in our series. In our last session, we talked about logic model, and in a second, we're going to go over a few things there. But today, we're really going to talk about theory of change. So as you kind of remember, the logic model in a lot of ways is the visual representation of what you put in the narratives for your theory of change. So if you get clear on which things go in the right buckets in your logic model, that should make working on your theory of change just that much easier. So we're going to go through, like I say, I want to make some comments about logic models, and then we're going to go through the three big buckets that belong in theory of change, which are very similar to some of the things we talked about last week. But sometimes, you know, you hear it a little different way after you've maybe looked at your logic model, and you might get some new ideas about how you actually write it up. So before we dive into the logic model piece, I wanted to kind of revisit, well, before we do theory of change, revisit logic model stuff. So 4 programs sent me logic models, and I'm most of the way through giving some feedback on that. So a few things I wanted to point out that I noticed kind of either in one or more of the logic models that I was looking at is be sure not to put some of the information that is really about the activity and what members are doing in the inputs column. That really needs to be in the activities area. So I think sometimes it's easy to think, okay, well, what do we need to do? What do we need to do this program? And that's what the input section is about. So yes, you have to mention how many members you have and how many sites you have, but then it's really about resources. Like, so maybe members need training, or you need some special equipment or curriculum materials or those kind of things. So make sure that the input column is really only kind of in the resources category. If you start talking about what members are going to do, that needs to move over and be in the column that's for the activities. Another thing I noticed is, you know, you all have it really clear in your head, like what activities you're doing, having members do, and what you hope happens because members are doing those things. But sometimes on the logic model, it's hard to read it like a diagram. So I know we mentioned briefly last time, if you've got activities that are different, it's better to put like a new line or a new row in your logic model and make sure you separate those things out so you can kind of build it across. And you got to think about what is somebody that is reviewing your application, what's going to make it the easiest for them to understand how you view what's going on. Because like, it's hard to know sometimes if there's like 5 short-term outcomes listed, well, which one goes with which activity? So the clearer you can make that, so whoever's reading it and reviewing it, like they don't have to like work overtime to try to figure out, match things up and then not know if they actually have that right. That's a tip. So I would suggest everybody take a look at that. So another thing that I think is completely common, but I would kind of recommend that you double check yourself on this, is one of the beauties of AmeriCorps to me, is that members do something with a group of beneficiaries, or if it's environmental program, doing something out in the environment. So there's what they do and what happens immediately. Like, you get to pick one thing to focus on to measure as your outcome, but it's never just that one thing. It's like AmeriCorps has all these ripples that your program creates, both in the short and the long term. And that's part of, like I say, I think that's part of the beauty of AmeriCorps. But you've got to be careful in a logic model to, it doesn't have to be a laundry list of all the positive ways that everybody's going to benefit from what members are doing. Make sure it's really clear. And if you're gonna list some additional things, make sure like what you're gonna have is your performance measures or like at the top. Because sometimes when you list 4 or 5 short-term outcomes, it doesn't mean those things aren't gonna happen and they're not important. But what somebody reviewing the logic model wants to be able to see kind of at in a snapshot view is, okay, they do this activity, this is how many people are going to be served, or how many acres of land are going to be treated. And then here's like what's going to change in the short term because of that. And if you list too many things, it then gets confusing about what you're really focusing on. Like I say, it doesn't mean those other things aren't important, but then, you know, you're in some ways getting clear in your own head, so that when you get to, and we're going to be talking about performance measures, when you are doing that piece, it's really clear in your logic model what you've picked out to measure. So sometimes when you list a lot of things, it's hard to kind of stay focused on what that is. So it doesn't have to be a laundry list of everything possible. That's all the great things that are going to change because of what your members are doing. Just focus on like the core, most important things. Andrea or Emily, anything that you want to add about logic models? I know you haven't seen, like we've seen people's stuff in the past, but you haven't seen some of the things that I've been noticing as I look at them. So any things you'd like to add, and just things you'd like people to double check themselves on?
I can't think of anything.
So, and I just want to make sure, because every state is a little bit different. So when I say don't overload, especially what you're counting as outputs and what all the possible outcomes are, not to do like a laundry list. I assume you would prefer to have them focus. Am I right on that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So before we move on, whether you looked at a logic model and emailed it off to me, and I'll say if you're on here and you didn't get that done, please, you know, the idea was that I could get these things and get you some feedback before today. Those of you that have turned in logic models, I'll get you back your feedback today so you have them. My comments as you're thinking about your theory of change, which is going to be our next chunk of homework. But if you didn't email one to me and you want me to take a look at it and give you some ideas, and it's food for thought, you're not obligated to do anything I suggest, but sometimes it's useful to have somebody from the outside take a look and give you some feedback. So if you didn't send me a logic model, feel free to go ahead and do that. And I'll turn those around as quickly as I can. So did anybody, as you maybe either looked at your logic model before you sent it off, or as you were listening to our session last time, were there any questions that came up about logic models that would be useful for us to just quickly talk about? Because I want to make sure if you have questions that we get those answered. Anybody have anything?
Well, I think you hit on it mostly around the uh, I'm gonna say like ease of ease of reading or like attractiveness. It's hard in the eGrant system to create a logic model that reads very easily because of the way you're forced into like one line across. And I don't know, maybe as much to the group. Has anyone had luck like figuring out a way to do that well? Like, it takes lots of trial and error. I've tried different ways, but it's like only so much time trying to like play in there, you know?
Well, I know I don't have access to eGrants anymore now that I'm not an eGrants trainer. So but I do see people's logic models coming through with more than one line. So does anybody know how to do that?
The secret is to hit Control Return if you want a blank line in Excel.
That's in Excel. And then,
Yep. And if you're working in Word and then you dump it in, if you leave yourself a blank line, it will create a blank line. And that is one of the ways of creating blocks of text within these columns.
and then based on what Stephen was getting at, I guess there's still like, so trying to get it into eGrants and have lines may be a separate issue. So,
yeah, it turns everything into a text. And so if you want to use bullet points, you've got to use an asterisk, and that's about it. I have looked, there are some online examples of what other people have submitted. And for the most part, they use asterisks and they use blank spaces to designate. Based on Sue's comments, Sue's comments this morning, I was going to number my outputs across so that so that it's easier to line them up if they're numbered instead of asterisk.
yeah, that seems like that could be a good solution, and like because sometimes it might be, it's the same community need, but you've got two activities that that members are doing, two big buckets, and maybe they have slightly different ways you're counting people or like what the outcomes are. So like I worked with one program, and I should look back at their logic model that they put in the system, but it's like they had math tutoring and English tutoring, and they separated those out. And of course that in the end, it's still ED 1A, how many people got served, because it's an education program. But because it was two different activities, it's in there twice. It's like number of individuals tutored in English and number of individuals tutored in math. And then I think it's ED5A, if I remember off the top of my head. But it's math proficiency and English proficiency. So what you're saying is like, if you number all the English stuff as ones and all the math stuff at twos, then somebody can easily read across and see what you're proposing and that you're clear how it all lines up. And it's just easier for them to understand as well. So that could be a good way through it. Any other questions or suggestions on logic models? Well, if you have anything, go ahead, and I can't see the chat, but I'm thinking either Emily or Andrea can, so they will make sure that your question gets asked. If you don't want to go off mute and ask yourself, it's completely fine. All right.
There's nothing in there right now, at least.
Thanks, Emily. So theory of change, part of the reason that it is so key, and in some ways CNCS forces you to do two versions of it. One is in the logic model, sort of the Cliff Notes version, and one is the narratives, is they want to really understand that you understand why you're doing what you're doing, what your members are going to be tasked with in terms of what their service looks like, and then how you think that's going to move the needle. So theory of change really is the basis of your program design. And it's also absolutely informs your performance measures, because what you are designing your program to do is going to be what you want to measure to report to Volunteer New Hampshire to show that you're doing what you said you were going to do. It also informs what you're going to focus on in your evaluation plan. Because if your evaluation in no way addresses something in your theory of change, then CNCS doesn't like that. So theory of change, like this is almost like an ongoing, there's always something to tweak to make clearer about what the problem is, what you're doing about it, and how you think you're going to move the needle. So that is why we're going to spend another whole session talking through this. And as we go through, if you've got something about your own program that you want to ask, or something more generally, you know, I know it's hard on these Zoom calls to feel like you can ask a question in the same way you could if we were all sitting in the same room, but this is the equivalent of sitting in the same room. So I really want to encourage you to step up and ask any questions as they pop into your head. And it doesn't matter if you're interrupting, like don't feel like you need to wait for the perfect moment, just ask your question. And you can either just unmute yourself and do that, or put it in chat and Emily will read it out for you. I think also part of the reason that theory of change is so important is that a lot of programs, there's the core piece of what their members are tasked with doing, but then there's also lots of other things that members can end up doing, and all of that doesn't have to be in the theory of change. The main buckets of activities, yes, but all the details about all the service projects that might be on the side, like you gotta make sure that you tease all those things apart and you're really clear on what's the core focus of your program overall. So this is a really ugly slide, but I just pulled it straight out of the NOFO. It's what CNCS says the theory of change shall address. And as we talked about last time, it's worth a chunk of points in the grant review process. So it absolutely is to your benefit to, even if you feel like you've already in past rounds have put a lot of effort in on your theory of change, it's absolutely worth your time to go back through and see how you might be able to tweak the language to make it clearer. And over time, you may have changed how you do things slightly based on continuous improvement sort of mindset. So you have to make sure that what was written maybe 3 years ago is still relevant to exactly what your members are doing right now. And part of what they are doing is what you say your members are going to do, does it relate to what you say the problem is? And then do you describe clear enough what members are doing so that anybody reading it can have the sense, if you're dealing with people, are the people being served getting enough service, whatever that looks like based on your program, so that the kind of outcomes you think they should have are likely to happen. You know, if you don't have much time with a given person, the kind of outcome that you would like want on your wish list, you may not be able to have it if members only are doing a 1-hour workshop and they're never going to see those people again. You can only help people improve their knowledge or get some ideas about how to change their behavior. It only goes so far. If you do a series of 3 one-hour things, then maybe you can expect them to learn more and be more willing to make some changes. So it really is important because it helps set the context for what you're going to measure for your performance measures. And they also want in this section some direct reference to, well, why AmeriCorps? Like, why is there added value with having AmeriCorps members doing whatever the service is? So what I want to cover in the time we have today is just briefly go over the need again, talk about intervention, outcomes, and why AmeriCorps. And you know, I may have cheated and used the new AmeriCorps logo that I think is being released today. But it came up online, so I figured, all right, I'll use it. So you'll be seeing and hearing way more about that. Okay, so let's start with the need piece. So this is where you really lay out what is the specific thing that your program is going to address and how big a problem is it? Like what CNCS and AmeriCorps headquarters have really wanted, and they have reinforced with state commissions, is they don't want to just fund things that people have a gut sense are important. They want to know that you actually have done some digging and know that it's actually a problem. And then you can explain why you picked that thing over. Every community has lots of issues. So why did you pick that one? And how much of a problem is it? They don't want people just doing like nice, good to do things. They really want to make sure that the interventions match the need.
So can I say something on that? A common issue that we find is that when people are writing the need, they either aren't including enough data that supports that problem need, or they're not including up-to-date, most recent data. So it's a common issue that we run into.
So that is, I definitely want to underscore what Andrea just said, like you all, and you know, we're all busy. Hopefully, you know, you're getting the chance to start in on this sooner rather than later, and we're kind of pushing you by doing this series. But if you had data and you've been around, your program's been around for a while, don't just regurgitate the old statistics. Look and see if there's some updated ones, especially depending on what your program's doing. You know, because of COVID-19, some issues that already existed in communities are actually worse right now. So, you know, taking the time and doing some Google searches, and maybe that means going to New Hampshire state agencies and seeing if they've been tracking what you need, or if some like United Ways or other groups, sometimes it's foundations, are tracking some of these things. Look and try to see like how up to date you can get the data to make your case. So the way CNCS talks about it in their online curriculum, there's 3 buckets of things that they basically want you to make sure you put in your needs statement. So it's like, how big is the problem? What's the scope of it? Who is affected? How many is it? They want to know like, well, how severe a problem is this? That some kids aren't graduating from high school. Okay, but what kind, is there a profile of the kids that aren't graduating? And what are the, like how many aren't? Like, so getting some sense of how big the problem is a piece of it. They also, you have to balance that with also kind of weaving a case about why it's important. What is the significance of this? Like if kids aren't graduating from high school, using that example, then maybe they're less employable, which feeds into a high unemployment rate. So by trying to help kids graduate from high school, you're trying to break some of that cycle of poverty stuff. And then why do things happen? What's the cause of it? And is there any data about that? Like sometimes it's, well, kids don't have access to after school programming. Well, why not? Is it parents are working, or it's an under resourced part of a community? So you kind of have to think about all three buckets here. And what you're trying to do is paint a picture that shows really in a clear way, this is the thing that we're taking on because we feel like we can start making inroads and help improve whatever that situation is. So to underscore what Andrea was saying, you know, you need to try to go out and look for the most recent data that's relevant to your areas where your program is going to be serving. So maybe if you can get local data, maybe you're comparing it to New Hampshire to show that, okay, where your members are serving is really under-resourced. But, you know, sometimes I see people that are operating in a small town using national stats to say this is a problem. Well, you got to try to get some data that's closer to the ground to where your members are actually going to be serving. And if they're serving in multiple places, like if they're in 20 different places, maybe you can't actually justify all of them, but you could say, for example, and then do a deep dive maybe on one location. And recent data, as recent as you can get it. I mean, depending on what you're looking for, everything doesn't get tracked all the time. If you're using census data, you know, that only happens on a set schedule. Certain agencies research things more frequently than others, but look for what's the most recent stuff you can get. And make sure it's from credible sources. So like you can see in these like 3 examples that I've pulled from different states, you know, one of which is from New Hampshire. It was 2016 data. So you're like, well, that's 4 years old. But if you look around, maybe that is the most recent you can find. And it's from the Census Bureau. So, okay, that's a credible source. North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, which is basically their Department of Education. One would assume that is credible. Colorado Department of Labor and Employment, that's again, it's a state agency. And so, you know, these are credible sources. What they don't want you to do is quote magazine or newspaper articles that don't cite sources. And speaking of citing sources, you have to say in your narrative who said it, where did you get the data from? You can't just say multiple studies show that. You got to give a real example, like what's the study that shows that provided the data that you're using in your narrative. So you actually have to make sure you cite the source, who did it, and the date.
Sue, that's another common issue that we find is that the applications don't properly cite the data that they have or sources that they're using. And I did want to add too that New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, New Hampshire is a great source for the most recent data with any social problem in the state. So a good resource.
Yeah, absolutely. So the good news is you're not expected to do this research yourself, but there's lots of folks that do research a lot of stuff on an ongoing basis. It's why they're alive, you know, on some level. So make sure you take the time and actually do some Google searches and go to the websites of some agencies that you think could have what you might need.
So we have some questions in the
Yeah.
chat. So you've already basically touched on this, but there's a question about what qualifies as current data. This year, 2 years ago, or just after the last AmeriCorps grant was submitted. And then how do we let the application reviewer know that this is the most relevant data that we've come by?
Well, I think you can always say based on the most recent data, you know, that we can find, and then, excuse me, and then quote it. And there's no hard and fast rule, because depending on what social issue you're looking at, these things happen. You know, CNCS, for some things like evidence, you know, they toss around within the last 6 years. So that's a good place to aim for, because sometimes stuff does change. But, you know, if it ends up being something 10 years old, and that's truly only the only thing you can find, it's better to use that than to have no data. But I would slide in a little bit of language that says, you know, based on the most recent data we could find, or, you know, something to show that you did at least make an effort to look for something, and you're giving the most up-to-date thing.
Yeah, if somebody put in that, you know, something from 2012 is the most recent, then yeah, we wouldn't question it. But if they just put in something from 2012, we might go back and say, hey, can you clarify that, is this the most recent? So just letting us know.
Yeah. So sometimes, you know, it doesn't have to be like, you don't have to like give a big song and dance about we looked, we couldn't find anything, you know, but a few words to let them know, like in some ways it heads off a question and it saves them time having to cycle back and ask you, and you having to cycle back and respond. So if it truly is the most recent thing, just say that.
We have another question that says, is there a preferred sourcing format or citing format, I would assume?
Andrea, do you have a way that you prefer it?
I would say, I mean, we just go off of a basic citing format, as long as, you know, the author's there, the year's there, the title's there, it's in italics. You know, we really just look at a basic format, but we've had stuff come in before that doesn't have anything attached to it, or it just has the author with nothing else. So
sometimes people feel like, I think like where you found it, it seems like my internet may be having some issues, so sorry about that. It seems like citing whatever organization did it and the date is usually, you know, that's about as basic as it gets. So it shouldn't be less than that. You know, sometimes people feel like they have to do like a whole online URL, but you know, I think that sometimes those can run on for like 4 lines, and space is an issue. And Andrea, do you have a preference? In some other states, I've seen people sort of do it like almost more in a footnote format. They number it and then they put it at the end of the need. When I read it, I personally prefer to see as I'm reading it where it came from, as opposed to like going to someplace else to look at what it was. Do you have a preference on that?
yes, we do. We prefer like your method, just having it right there next to you know, the source right next to what you're quoting or using for data. So
I would also add not to put in, like going off of the URLs, like don't put in like, oh, if you're interested, here's more information, and then putting a URL. Don't do that. We won't read it. Like
we get that a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, so sadly, it is all of your job to pick out the most relevant little tidbits. And there may be lots of other great stuff in whatever study you're looking at, but just pull out the things that are absolutely directly relevant to what you're proposing that you're going to do with your program. So some of these common issues we've talked about a bit, but I just want to underscore these. So a big one, I'm going to go to number 3 first, is I call it the kitchen sink approach, where you just dump everything in there. And the reality is every community that you work in has multiple issues, and some of them maybe indirectly or are a bit peripheral, but they do affect what you're working on. But make sure that you really focus the need that you're writing up on exactly the piece that you're going to try to do something about through your program. Like if you're not doing anything with poverty reduction, spending like a ton of valuable space on giving sort of contextual data, it's not going to help you. Like if you're talking about something with like working with kids after school, talk about what the issues are with what it is you're going to do with kids after school. You know, is it that they're latchkey kids? Is it that they need extra help with their coursework because there's stats that certain kids aren't performing well in school? Is it something else? There's some other deficit that you're taking on. So, and maybe like poverty is a piece of it, but sometimes people go way down a lot of rabbit holes talking about every possible thing that they can find stats on. And really the clearer you can be and keep it to just the core things that directly relate to what you're going to have members doing, it makes it just so much clearer. Andrea or Emily, do you see a lot of that whole kitchen sink thing?
We do, yes. It really including a lot of unnecessary information. We really only want to see information that supports the theory of change. And it gets too convoluted for us as readers, and we don't want to have to try to, you know, make sense of what are you really trying to address? Like, what is the main issue here? So don't include all that unnecessary information.
Well, and I mean, you may want to know that for some reasons, but the clearer you can make it, like I know sometimes when I read need statements, because of all the data, I think somebody's heading down this path. And then when I read what their intervention is, I'm like, what? Wait a minute. And then I go back, and the piece that's really directly related to what they're doing, maybe there's less data on that. So then I'm like, do they really even know why they're doing what they're doing? Maybe they really should be doing this activity because they actually built a case for it with the stats. So that's one thing to look at for yourself is, you know, what's the real direct issue that you're going to take on? And you don't have to present everything. It makes it way too hard for readers to figure out, boom, like exactly where you're focusing. So sometimes in the needs section, another common thing is people start, instead of just making the case for why something's a problem, they start justifying what their agency has done in the past or what the program's done in the past, or start explaining something about the program model. That's not talking about the problem. That's, you know, maybe belongs elsewhere, but like, so the organizational stuff maybe goes in organizational capacity somewhere. If you're trying to make the case that this organization works in this area and has some expertise, great, but it doesn't go in the needs statement. And things about, well, our program was designed to address the issue of, that also doesn't belong in the needs statement. The needs statement is really pretty much what it says. It's the community problem and how big is it and what causes it and that sort of stuff. It's not a justification. a direct justification of what you're planning to do. We've already talked about using data that's as local as possible and as current as possible. And another thing you have to keep in mind is the need and the outcome need to be really, really closely related. And we'll talk about that a bit more. Now, this is a big old bunch of words. But what I wanted, this is from an actual application I reviewed recently. So if you just look briefly at it, you know, oopsie, I went past. They've got 2015 census data, 2017. And, you know, they started down the right path, but then they started into justifying the agency, that the agency, the Literacy Council, has taught more than 1,000 students in the last 5 years and is gonna provide instruction for more than 400 unduplicated students in 2019, and why AmeriCorps support is needed. So that's not the stuff that goes in the needs statement. So when I gave them feedback, that was all strike through, take that out. And then they started talking about how they get their students. We don't recruit or advertise. We grow by word of mouth. You know, that stuff isn't part of the needs statement. But then, you know, they sort of start getting back to it when they say, you know, that they're only serving 10% of the folks with limited English proficiency. So they've got a few things in there that they need to kind of do a better job of painting the case with, but they've put a lot of irrelevant stuff in there that doesn't actually help you understand, well, who are these people and how big a problem is it? And like, what's going to happen in the future if they don't do this? You know, kids won't, and who are they talking about? Are they talking about adults? Because when you say students, you don't know if we're talking adults or kids, K-12, like who are they talking about? And how big an issue is it with that? So hopefully you see kind of what I'm getting at there. Like it blurs what the issue is because of all this other stuff they've tossed in. So usually, like when you think about the theory of change, you usually think about it, need, intervention, and then intended outcome. But I'm going to talk about it today in a different order because the intended outcome needs to really closely relate to what you say the problem is that your program is going to take on. Because if you think of a coin, there's two sides, and the problem is one side and the desired outcome, like you can't separate the two. So if the problem is, and as in this example, is third graders aren't reading at grade level, what you want to have happen if your program is successful is because of the service your members do, maybe tutoring third graders in reading or whatever that looks like, you're hoping that you're going to get them reading closer to grade level in the third grade. So you've got to double check yourself that what you say is the need is really closely related to what you say is the outcome that you're hoping for. And I would even say the short-term outcome that you're probably going to be measuring your performance measures with, not some big long-term one, although that may be in there, but these things need to closely relate. And if they're kind of tangential, something needs to change. Either you need to go back and revamp your problem statement, or you need to think about, did we actually pick the right outcome? I think we talked briefly last time about in the past, there was a strong push from CNCS headquarters to get as many programs as possible to opt into national performance measures. And so sometimes programs signed on for things that weren't actually a good fit with the problem they were designed to address and what their members were actually doing. And that they've backed off that. They'd way rather you measure an outcome that actually is logically comes from the focus that your members have with whatever they're doing. So these days, like this stuff all should match. It's got to be tightly interwoven. And if your desired outcome doesn't sound like your problem, you either aren't talking about the right outcome or you didn't define the right problem. They absolutely need to be woven together. And I can't like underscore that enough, because if you paint this great case about a problem and then everybody's reading through your grant application and they get to what you say your desired outcome is, you don't want them like scratching their head and going, well, where did that come from? It like that you're going to solve world peace in one program year? No, but you want to make sure that part of your problem statement gets granular enough that it directly relates to something that your program can actually take on in terms of what members are doing and how it's going to make positive change.
Sue, can I add something?
Yeah, please.
And I would also probably recommend, like, for example, this problem, so third graders not reading at a grade level. So that's the problem, but also kind of, as you talked about, like, you know, not just saying that and then like not saying, so, I mean, if third graders don't read at a grade level in third grade, but in fourth grade they catch up and it's fine. Like, I think that's kind of like you have to put, you know, if third graders are not reading at a grade level in this community, that means that probably they're the ones who are going to end up dropping out of school at some time, or to make sure that it's sort of backed up with like, not just that third graders are not reading at a grade level, like what does that mean? Like, and how that affects, you know, outcomes.
And I really want to underscore what Emily's reminding you all of, because that's really what the significance piece is. We were talking about a few minutes ago. It's like, okay, yeah, but because they're not, what does that mean? And actually painting that picture. So thanks for bringing that up, Emily. Okay, so in the intended outcome section, there's different kinds of outcomes, the way CNCS looks at outcomes, and they're basically in these 4 buckets. And we'll talk more about the distinctions here when we're really talking about performance measures and how you're gonna measure the change that you're planning to make, you have your members make, either in the environment or with people. And so we'll talk more about what each of those really looks like and what to keep in mind there. But in your theory of change narrative, remember, you're really taking what was in your logic model and making it paragraph form. It's not the in some ways, you know, the logic model is the cliff notes, and then you're supposed to expand on this. So you have to think about, but also make sure it's very clear what's the intended outcome. That's the short-term one that you're gonna measure. That, you know, there's all these lovely long-term things. They can't happen if some of the shorter-term things don't happen. So you have to kind of talk through maybe all of that, but I would say emphasize the shorter-term one. Andrea or Emily, as people are talking about short, medium, and long-term outcomes in a narrative, what do you look for primarily? Do you want them to more focus on what they're going to measure for their performance measures, or do you want them to kind of talk about all of it?
I would say it's a little bit of everything, all of it. Yeah.
Okay. Any questions on that? And I think we talked a little bit about, you know, knowledge, attitude, behavior, and condition. Condition, I think, is the harder thing to figure out later how you're going to measure, but in some ways that's the ultimate goal, working with people, and probably for the environmental stuff, especially if you're doing trail work or some kind of physical labor to improve land or water quality. What you're getting at is condition, but sometimes that takes a few years. It doesn't happen overnight. So like if members are like rebuilding watershed quality, there's what's going to be the change that's immediate, that something happens, but then it's the longer term thing that you maybe never actually measure directly. That is the big picture reason why you're actually doing what you're doing. So here's a sample from a theory of change of somebody's write-up of their outcomes. So that an outcome goal of the program is to recruit and place members? No. Like all programs have to recruit and place members. That's part of the program management piece. So in your theory of change, in the intervention section, you're going to talk about what members are doing, because that sets the stage for the kind of change. But you don't need to put anything in about recruiting and placing members. And also here, like what they're really doing is kind of talking about the output and the outcome, but calling it all outcomes. So again, that's something to check yourself on. Like that number 1, I think needs to go. And it may be that it's like a sentence before this that says AmeriCorps members in rural behavioral healthcare host site settings will provide 500 screenings to rural underserved people, full stop. And then there's a discussion about what the outcome is, why them doing that should make a difference. Yeah, and then they're saying, like, I don't think you really need to totally get into how you're going to measure it here, just what the change is going to be. So Andrea or Emily, what are your thoughts on that? Do you expect, like, they should keep the discussion about what tool they're going to use to measure their outcome, not in the theory of change, but talk about that in the performance measurement section?
They can. I mean, they can include it in there. That would be, I mean, we wouldn't hold it against them to do that, but I don't think it's necessary.
Okay. And if you find yourself like needing to cut something, that might be something you could pare back, but you know, it's not like it's a ding to include it, but just make sure that it aligns with the substance abuse, the substance use sort of thing. And the need presumably is about substance use in the areas where this program's operating. We don't have that, but that would be something to check. So any questions on talking about either the need or the outcome? People see what I'm getting at, where these two things need to sound similar, even though the problem is bigger than your AmeriCorps program can solve by itself. I get that, but you're trying to make the case that here's the issue and we're going to do something about that specific issue. Okay.
Nothing in the chat box.
Okay. So let's talk about the intervention. So as you know, that's the specific set of activities that members and volunteers, if they're working sort of side by side, I see a typo, sorry about that. Maybe volunteers are serving with members, then you would mention that volunteers are also doing this in conjunction with members, but a lot of the time it's just the activities that your members are doing. And like as you're revisiting it and what anybody outside reviewing your application is thinking, okay, if this is the need that you say is in the community, and this is what you want to take on as something that you feel like you can move the needle on through an AmeriCorps program, the middle question is, are you actually doing that in the best possible way to get to the outcome you want? And then what does that look like? So I'm mentioning evidence here. We're going to do a whole session on evidence because it's everybody's heartburn section of a grant application. But part of why CNCS has come down so heavy on evidence is because it's a way, if you're a new program, to really think about, well, how have other AmeriCorps programs or other programs in general designed their services to make the kind of positive outcome that we also want? What did that look like? Like, what were people doing and how much service did people get? What did it look like? So evidence helps get clearer on that. And so sometimes that's really useful for a newer program. But if you a program that's been around for a while, sometimes looking at evidence or how other programs are structured, again, trying to go for the same kind of outcome, sometimes you get some ideas about how to do continuous improvement of your own program model, which then you would reflect in your intervention description. So like we're kind of going through these sections kind of in the way that they're laid out in the CNCS and the Volunteer New Hampshire NOFO, but just realize there's some like back and forth, and these things all inform each other. So the logic model in some ways is a way to like get clear in a quicker way, like how all the pieces fit together. Then you have to write it in paragraph form. But if you haven't already started looking at evidence, you know, in the ideal world, you probably would have done that before you write up your theory of change, because what the intervention looks like might be different. But I think in the real world, evidence is usually a backfill kind of a thing that people are doing because they know they have to, as opposed to viewing it as an opportunity to figure out, oh, well, what did this program do that made them successful? Or what did they do that didn't work? Because we don't want to do that. We want to do more of the things that work and less of the things that don't.
So if I could add to, for the intervention section, another common issue that we run into is that people don't list out the actual activities that members will be doing.
That is really critical. Now, and I think and correct me if this is isn't what you want, Andrea, but it's like, you have to think about what are the major arms or buckets of what members are doing. So like sometimes everybody's doing kind of the same thing as their main service. Sometimes maybe you've got one group of members doing this and another group of members doing something else. You have to make sure you describe both things. There may be some other smaller things that the program does, like with service projects or things, but some of that probably doesn't belong here. Would you say that's right, Andrea? Is that how you like to see it?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, so just using an example, if we were looking at like a program wanting to having environmental stewardship and doing trail work as one component, and then environmental education with youth, we'd want to hear about both of those and the activities, member activities for both of those.
And you know, like there's if it's only, so where I think if this section gets hard, the intervention section, is if like you're a rural intermediary and you've got people onesies at a bunch of agencies and trying to cover the main things that the program's about. Most of your programs probably are not in that format, but you may have some major buckets. So you have to be really clear who's doing what, where are they doing it. You know, sometimes it's fascinating that it never is stated in the narrative that members are doing it. And there's a program I talked with last week in another state, excuse me, and they were confused. They were actually talking about what the agency does as opposed to the AmeriCorps program, and their performance measures, they were measuring their own agency, not what the members were doing. Duh, like you don't want to be doing that. But you need to say, okay, if members are doing it, if they have got volunteers serving alongside them, you can say that. But who are they doing it with? Where are they doing it? When are they doing it? So the design needs some meat to it. Like maybe in the logic model, you've got 2 or 3 sentences, but in the narrative, you need to be way more specific than that. If you're using a curriculum, who developed it? But then you also have to, at the same time, be talking about the dosage. And this is where a lot of folks don't do justice. They don't describe what members are doing clearly enough. They don't say, how intense is it? Is it a 20-minute session? Is it a 1-hour session? Is it a 3-hour whatever? How often does it happen? Is it a one-time thing? Is it twice a week? Once a month? How often does it happen? And then over what period of time? So it might be, I was just working with a program that uses the Cooking Matters curriculum to do some nutrition / cooking sorts of things for healthy futures. So they have people doing a 90-minute class every week for like a month. But that needs to be specified. So where it gets tough is if you've got multiple things. So maybe members do short in a classroom presentations of 20 minutes. Maybe it's a series, maybe it's a one-shot thing. Maybe they also do 1-hour things. Maybe some of those are one shot and some of those are over multiple sessions. So if you've got a range, even within one bucket of activity, so to use Andrea's example, like if there was a piece that's say environmental education, members may be giving the education in a range of ways. So you at least need to kind of talk about what's that look like? That you have to describe absolutely every format? No, but you need to give some sense that there's a range. They range from 20 minutes once on site to in the classroom series of 3 for 30 minutes each. You have to like give a little more detail on that. And that's a common place that people, they're like, well, we do it so many different ways. We can't possibly talk about the dosage. Well, yes, you have to try. And maybe you have to say the average person roughly gets this much contact, i.e. dosage. And some people will get less and some people will get more. Andrea, anything on that you want to add about dosage and what you look for?
No. I did want to add one thing though with, I guess in the design, something else that we see too is people not including service sites or service locations, I should say. They might be general with, oh, we're going to serve statewide after school programming, or, in this county, well, we'd like it to be a little bit more specific. Is it going to be with the Boys and Girls Club or the YMCA, or what towns are you actually targeting?
And kind of, you made me think of something else. So another thing that I see a lot is sometimes, especially for programs that do out of school time sorts of activities, there's maybe what happens sort of either on weekends or after school. But then in the summer, there's a more intensive, excuse me, maybe the program is doing pretty much what they would do after school, maybe with a few other activities, but it's like a 3-week session in the summer. So I would actually describe those as two different things, and not try to cram them all together, because I think you don't actually do justice to either one of them that way. Like, I think you need to talk about the main part of the program, which would be the ongoing stuff that happens, say, I'm just going to make it up, after school program, where that happens, what sites you use, what are members actually doing with the kids, all of that. And then also have a section that says, you know, and we also do a summer program and it looks like this, and then describe that. But like, sometimes people try to talk about it more generally so it covers both things, but then I think neither thing is clear enough. Well, this is what we were just talking about. If you've got multiple activities, you really have to talk about the design and dosage of each of them separately. And, you know, another thing to just keep in mind is if the activities are different enough, you really are supposed to have a need statement for each chunk and evidence for each chunk. So in some ways, you know, as evidence especially has come on board, that's been like a huge motivator for some programs to pare back what they're doing, to really focus, go deeper, be able to have like greater outcomes, because they don't have onesies doing a whole bunch of different things, but like having like greater level of effort on fewer things. It's easier to justify in a grant application. And so just know, if you have too many activities, you do need to like also reference it in the need that backs up, well, why are you doing a summer program? Not just because you always did one, but there's probably something like kids, if there's like tutoring in the summer, it's like, well, because kids backslide, you know, school districts and have stats about that. Or if it's that kids are left alone and they can get in trouble or injured, like there's stats that exist for that. So like, why are you doing a summer program? Not just because it's nice, but you need to have like a need thing. And then you also, technically, for each major bucket of activity, you have to have evidence for each of those. And we'll talk more about this when we talk about evidence, but your program gets, the points you get for evidence are based on what the strongest chunk of your program is. But they do expect that you're going to give some evidence for all the major things that you've described in your theory of change. So that's just a heads up. We're going to be talking more about that. So in the intervention section, I want to just underscore again some of the common issues. As Andrea said, really being clear about what activities are members providing. That's a common place where there's just not enough detail about what members are doing, where they're doing it, who they're doing it. The dosage is often an area that's unclear. And a common mistake here is people talk about how much members provide in general, not what individual people receive. So saying that members are available Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 9 to 5 doesn't tell you anything about, okay, the people that they serve, how much interaction do they actually have with them? So what the dosage should be is not how much members are available to do, but how much does an individual receive? And if it's an environmental program, it's a bit different. It's more like, then it might be, okay, they're gonna work on whatever project all day long for as many days as, you know, it takes to do it. But if you're dealing with people, what you've got to think about is like how much in general service does the average person get? And that's sometimes hard to figure out and estimate. And programs that I've worked with are really hesitant to do that. They're like, yeah, but we do it so many different ways. We're customized to meet individual needs. Yes, that's all true, but you've got to give some sense about, are they getting 1 hour total or are they getting 10 hours? And part of the reason you need to be clear about that is, and we'll talk about this when we talk about performance measures, is you're only gonna do outcome measurements on people that meet a minimum threshold of service. So you have to have thought through in your mind, how much do we, in the ideal world, what would we want people to get to start making the sorts of changes that we want them to have? And that's part of your dosage, not just how much members provide. Okay. Sometimes there's stuff in the intervention section that actually belongs elsewhere, and it clouds the clean description of what your members are doing. Common things that end up getting shoved in the intervention section are stuff about member training. There's other places to put that in the grant application. So that's a thing to check to make sure it's in the right place. Sometimes people start putting past performance measurement information in the intervention section. Doesn't belong there. I think because people are still not really comfortable with evidence, sometimes they're putting evidence in the intervention section instead of the evidence section. And when reviewers have a checklist, they're not going to flip back to all the different sections to see if you happen to mention a good study. It needs to be in the right place. So when you're looking through how you describe your intervention, make sure you're not doing a big hoo-ha about how members get trained and life after AmeriCorps, and that doesn't belong here. Neither does the performance measurement stuff from the past, because that's also evidence. So if you're in the pre-preliminary level, it's going to be talked about in a different section. And don't be quoting studies to back up why you're doing certain interventions here. Make sure because you'll need to talk about those in the evidence section. And then another thing just to double check is, are the activities that we're talking about, do they relate to what we said the need was? It's surprising how many times that link isn't quite as strong as you think would be self-obvious. So that's another thing to just double check yourself on to make sure that, you know, it's all in alignment. Andrea or Emily, anything else you'd like to say about any of these?
No, I have nothing to add.
All right, so here's one that did exactly what I just told you not to do, but I wanted to like really reinforce it. So in this intervention description, what they were saying is that 20 full-time members are going to give 35 hours a week of direct service at one of 4 sites. And they say, okay, they're going to serve 1,000 people Monday through Friday, 9 to 6. Here's the summer hours. But if you read this, you've got no idea what members are actually doing with the people. And they're there. Do they actually work with any people in a day? Like this is just way not enough information. So not that any of you are as general as this, but this was kind of an extreme case that I think, you know, makes my point. If you read this, you really have no clue what these full-time members are actually doing. So not only does that make the whole theory of change tough, but when you start looking at evidence and performance measures, like it's hard to know if they're focused in the right place because there's just way not enough detail about what members are doing, who they're doing it with, for how much time. So any questions on any of that about theory of change and tips and or strategies? Is there anything that you've done as you look at your own theory of change that you think might be useful food for thought for your fellow New Hampshire programs? Emily, I assume nothing's coming through in chat.
Nope, nothing yet. There is something I would maybe like to add as just like a reminder. I mean, it's right there in the NOFO as well, but just once again, don't assume people know anything about the community that you're working in. So, I mean, if you said that if your members are serving in Manchester, like we know what that means. We know that Manchester is urban and it's a bigger New Hampshire city, but like you can't just assume that anyone, especially in the competitive competition, that they know what that means. So like just adding a couple sentences about why you're putting your members in certain places is, you'll never go wrong.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And you got to figure that, like especially anybody that goes up competitively, people are on panels. They're from all over the country. They get a stack. They have a limited amount of time that they have to read them and fill out the sheets and get their stuff back in. So if they have to like think too much and look in different places and they don't really understand the locations, to Emily's point, it's way easier to not get as many points as you might deserve if things aren't in the right places in the format that they expect to find it. So it's like really following the NOFO and some of these tips that we've been sharing really will help maximize that you get as much credit as you deserve for what you're up to.
I'd like to raise my hand and ask a question.
Okay.
We're not doing a nationally competitive application. Is it a new committee looking at the proposals each time, or is it the same group year after year?
So I guess I didn't understand the first part of your comment. Were you asking if it's
I'm saying
national?
in New Hampshire,
Yep.
if you're not doing a nationally competitive grant, is it the same committee looking at it each year, or is it a different group each year?
Okay, so in a non-nationally competitive grant would be our formula or a state grant.
Yes.
So it's always the staff that are reviewing it, and then the outside reviewers would be different or could be different. It's a mixture of board members and then outside community members.
Thank you.
And Andrea, then after it's all been reviewed, your commissioners then vote on who to fund, correct?
That's correct. Yep, we put it before our board, our executive committee, and then they vote on whether or not to move it forward.
So even if it was the same reviewers every year, I mean, it doesn't really matter. You'd have to treat it the same as if they were different, just because, I mean, we're always trying to make sure our state applications are sort of working towards being able to be submitted to competitive as well. So, treat it the same.
Yeah. And, the reality is there's tweaks that CNCS makes over time that then the state commissions have to reflect in their own requests for applications. So, even if it's the same people, they may be judging against some different criteria over time. Like over the past, I think it's 3 years, how things get scored has changed based on how CNCS is looking at the values for each of the sections. So like, it's always better to have the view, I think, that like, think of it as fresh and it's all new people reading it, and you don't want to just cut and paste everything that you've said before. Make sure it still really is relevant. And there you go. So what we're asking you to do, and again, I know like everybody's busy and you know, the deadline isn't yet, but it's coming up soon. Really want you to take some time this week and revisit your theory of change narrative, and see if, based on all the things that we've talked about, especially some of the common issues that all three of us have shared, look to make sure that you're not guilty of any of those. And if maybe you weren't as clear as you need to be, make some revisions. And what, again, is like, this is a great opportunity because of Volunteer New Hampshire providing my time. Like, send it to me and I'm glad to get you some feedback on, I read a lot of these things from a lot of different states. So hopefully I could give you some food for thought that might help you either like pat yourself on the back that you're already really on the right path, or give you some food for thought about how you might strengthen it just a tad. So one of the things that I also sent along is a theory of change checklist that basically comes out of some of the things from the CNCS core curriculum materials and last year's NOFO, but that didn't change really between last year and this year. So don't freak that it says 2021 instead of 21-22. But this is just meant to help you, as because sometimes you're so close to it, you have a lot of stuff in your head about like how your program works. But as you're reviewing your needs, your intervention, your outcome, ask yourself these questions. Even if you don't use this checklist and physically check things off, we're not asking you to like use this and turn it in, but it's really meant to help you have fresh eyes on your own narratives and figure out where you might be able to strengthen it. You know, the reality is you can tweak this stuff till you're blue in the face. So I would say don't get too caught up in like you got to revamp the whole thing if it really doesn't need it. But there may be some places where you can add a little bit of additional detail and it would actually skyrocket the clarity of what you have written. So that's really what we're asking you to do. So any questions on that? And those of you that turned in logic models, I will get your feedback to you later today so you have that as your, because it might affect how you're thinking about your theory of change as well.
I have a question that relates back to Andrea's comment.
Okay.
I understand that the goal is to move into a national 3-year cycle competitive application, but I don't understand what the advantages are to that move.
Okay, good question. So our formula funding, which is the funding that we get as a state commission, we grant it out as just 1-year funding. We may put you into a continuation with that formula funding. So at best, you're going to be 2 years funding with us. The competitive funding is 3-year funding through CNCS. So it's a better route for you to go that way to get more guaranteed funding for 3 years.
And Andrea, if I could tack on, it, I assume New Hampshire is the same as a lot of other state commissions in that how you look at it, the mindset part is that, okay, so the formula funding is a population-based formula that CNCS has. And so it's kind of a fixed bucket of funding that goes to every state. And it's related to how big is your state and how many people are in it at the end of the day. And so every state has lots of needs. And one way that some formula dollars can be freed up to be given to another organization is if some of the stronger programs can go up and get that funding, as Andrea was just describing, from a different bucket, because the competitive dollars, that's a different bucket of funding. And then what that program that got competitive funding, what happens is the formula dollars, then the commission has some other dollars they can play around with and figure out how to use to continue growing AmeriCorps in the state. If nobody gets funded at the competitive level and they have to fund everybody out of formula, then that gets really tough, because sometimes then programs have to be asked to downsize or this or that. So a strategy about how to grow AmeriCorps in pretty much every state in the country is to try to get some of the stronger programs funded out of that other pool of money, because then in this case, New Hampshire has more choices they can make about how to bring other programs along, build their capacity, and have AmeriCorps solve local needs.
Yeah, thanks, Sue, for that. And that we have had that happen before, where we've had programs that have been funded competitively for years, all of a sudden didn't get funded, and they were strong programs, very much needed in our state. So we decided to fund them out of formula dollars. So what that meant is that we couldn't fund any new programs, or we couldn't continue possibly a formula program that was going into its second year. So we are always, we use formula as kind of an incubator to basically go on up to competitive, to start off new programs just coming out of a planning grant, to fund planning grants, and basically, yeah, kick off new programs and then get them to a certain level where they can get funded competitively. And I'm, I guess, proud to say that we get a lot of our programs are funded competitively. We're one of the few states that the majority of our portfolio gets picked up. So yeah, something we're proud of.
Win, actually, a very big win. Well, we are at the end of our time. So any other questions before we sign off for today? And if you don't ask it now, feel free to send me an email, and I'm glad to answer anything that came up for you. Or as you start to look at your theory of change, if before you feel comfortable sending it to me to take a look at, if you have any questions, again, ask. You know, that's why I'm here supporting Andrea and Emily, is, you know, you got now multiple people you can get some input from. So I strongly suggest you take advantage of it. So nothing more from me. We'll see you next week. Anything, Andrea or Emily, that you'd like to say to wrap up?
No, just thank you very much. We look forward to next week.
For those of you who are recompeting in this upcoming NOFO, the intent to apply is due next Monday.
There you go. TikTok, stay on it, right? Okay, everybody, nice to see you.
Thank you.
We've got some food for thought from today, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sue. Bye, everyone.